Hi everyone, hello. We're gonna give a few minutes before starting, so please go grab a coffee or something to drink for you to feel more comfortable with the session, okay? And also let us know in the chat if you feel more comfortable with English or Spanish, right? Sorry for that, everyone. Hello, for those who are just joining us. Hola a todos, hola a todas. Bienvenidos a esta sesión. Por favor, vayan por algo antes de que empecemos. Vamos a dar unos minutos más. Aquellas personas que se sientan cómodas hablando español y no se sientan cómodas con el inglés, por favor, déjenoslo saber en el chat, ya que nuestra host de esta sesión solo habla inglés. ¿Ok? Entonces, si necesitan algún apoyo, lo vamos a hacer esta traducción simultánea que ya hemos hecho, pero si se sienten cómodos con el inglés, lo podemos dejar así y podemos dar la sesión, continuarla, ¿vale? In case you feel more comfortable with English, that would be great because the speaker only speaks in English. So in case you need the simultaneous translation, we are asking for those who only speak Spanish to help them, all right? So we're gonna give you 5 more minutes or less. You can go grab something and we'll see you right after these minutes, okay? Nos vemos en unos minutos, vayan por algo de tomar y volvemos para la sesión, ¿va? Hello there, everyone. How are you? Welcome to this UX design workshop session for you. I am so excited to see you all here, and we hope you are excited to be here too, because this may be the last workshop for you before the big event, all right? Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todos a este gran evento de UX, de diseño para el usuario. Esta podría ser la última sesión, ya estamos muy felices de verlos a todos por aquí. Por favor, no duden en seguir compartiendo esto para sus compañeros en caso de que ellos no puedan unirse aquí, ¿ok? Don't forget to be sharing this session with all your partners or your teammates so they know exactly what you've seen in this in case it's going to be really important for you for your project, all right? So welcome everybody. We want to remind you that this session will be recorded, okay? And also it's going to be transmitted into YouTube, okay? So you can share the link later. We're gonna give it to you over the chat, okay? But this is also going to be on YouTube for those who can join us directly to the Zoom, okay? Esta sesión va a ser grabada y además va a ser transmitida por YouTube. Al rato les vamos a dar el link en el chat para aquellos que no puedan estar en esta sesión de Zoom, pues igual lo puedan ver aquí por YouTube, ¿ok? Also, we want to remind you, and it's really important that you keep sharing the hashtag Bitcoin Bankathon. Remember, there is a prize for the social media hero, and it can be you. So please keep sharing everything you can about all your project. Obviously, keep your secrets with you, but keep sharing this, all right? Les queremos recordar también que sigan compartiendo el Bitcoin Hackathon. Es muy importante porque a partir de ahí ustedes pueden ganar un premio muy importante que es el Social Media Hero. ¿Okay? Entonces compartan todo lo que puedan. Por supuesto pueden mantener algunas cosas en secreto para todos ustedes y sus compañeros, pero es muy importante que esto lo estén compartiendo. ¿Vale? All right, guys, we just want to remind you our agreements. Okay, this is really important for us that you keep your microphone muted. If in case you can, open your camera for us to see you, that would be amazing. And also any comments or questions you have over this session, please let us know on the chat. Okay, we're gonna read them in the end when we have this Q&A session, this Q&A moment, okay? Para todas aquellas personas, estos son nuestros acuerdos de la sesión. Por favor, el micrófono en mute, la cámara encendida. Nos encantaría poder estarlos viendo, si no, no pasa absolutamente nada. Y en el chat escriban todos los comentarios o todas las preguntas que lleguen a tener, porque hasta el final, donde tengamos esta sección de Q&A, de preguntas y respuestas, es cuando los vamos a poder leer, pues para nuestra speaker. ¿Ok? Well, then, it is my pleasure to present you the team. First, it's going to be me co-facilitating this in Spanish for those who can't understand the English. And of course, I'm going to give a head to Tamara Sabag. She's going to be the UX designer over this little journey we're going to have about the UX design, the workshop, and she works in API tree, right? So Tamara, after I finish translating this in Spanish, go ahead and this is going to be your moment, okay? Tamara Sabag es la diseñadora del UX. Yo voy a estar facilitando para aquellos que no entiendan el inglés estas partes en español. Y pues bueno, les voy a hacer la palabra a Tamara. Tamara, this is your moment, please.
All right, so I am, okay. So my name is Tamara. Thank you all for tuning in today. I'm going to give everyone a rundown of a lot of the UX basics that you're going to need for your projects. And it doesn't matter too much how far into your project you are, you can always take a lot of the tips that you learn here today. So just in case you want to skip around, today we'll talk about first what UX design is, why you need a UX designer. Then we'll talk about the double diamond processes, what you do in the 4 phases: the discover phase, the define phase, the design phase, and the iterate phase. All right. Oh. So you might think, why does my team even need a UX designer? As Steve Jobs said, Design is not just what it looks and feels like, design is how it works. So a wonderful solution to the wrong problem will cause your product to fail. User experience designers make sure that you're solving the right problem with the right solution. We advocate for the user and what the user needs and wants while also achieving the business goals. So it's a bit of a balance, but it's really centered around the people that you're designing for. As time goes on, more and more businesses are moving towards user-centered design. But why is that? Oh. So there are a lot of reasons why it's important to kind of center your product around the user, but a few of the main ones include that in the long run, developing the product is a lot less expensive. Good user experience increases brand loyalty from your audience, brings about a positive product perception, and increases the conversion rates. So user experience design and design thinking, they all revolve around a process of research, analysis, testing, and really reiterating that until you have the desired outcome. When a product is designed with the user in mind, it needs a lot less redesign in the future because when you do all the testing and all the research, you have all of those usability issues ironed out and fixed. So it's a lot cheaper to fix them in the beginning than to put in all that development time to make it nice and shiny and then find out that you actually have to make some major changes that cause the developers to do everything all over again. So it increases brand loyalty because when you revolve something around a user's need and wants, they realize that. And it builds a lot of trust between the user and the team that's building the product. So such an attitude not only attracts new users, but increases the loyalty, which helps retain users and in the long run increases revenue as well. Having a user-centered design also increases product perception. So that means that it helps differentiate your brand from the competitors. It can be argued that you've probably heard that people notice a design when it's really bad, but it can also be argued that they really appreciate details when it feels smooth and intuitive and easy to use. And I would say that's especially true for a lot of the Apple products. And last but not least, having a good user experience increases conversion rates. So for those that don't know, a conversion rate is the percent of users who take a desired action over the total number of visitors. So the higher conversion rate you have, the better it is because the people who visit are actually able to complete their goal and they're basically wanting what you have. But if the user experience isn't as good and the user takes too long to find what they need, they're probably going to go elsewhere. So low conversion rates means they're probably going to turn to competitors, and high conversion rates means that they want your product, they found your product, and they were able to achieve their goals using your product. So today we're going to talk about the basics of the double diamond. The double diamond was introduced in 2005 by the British Design Council. It's a strong process that is pretty similar to design thinking and helps organize UX efforts. Like in design thinking, it relies on understanding the problem before creating a solution. So many products are designed because the user has an idea that they liked, the creator has an idea that they liked, but too often the product turned out to be a great solution for a completely different group of people. So how do you avoid the pitfall, and how do you know that your product will address the right problem? You do this through user research. And the first double diamond, called Discover, highlights the need to research your audience. So you need to learn about your audience, and the most important thing to keep in mind is that you are not your audience. No matter how much you think that you know what they want, and you would pick this product because you think it's great, you can never ever assume that you think the same way your audience does. So you're likely making assumptions that will hurt your project in the end. And that's definitely something you don't want to do. So they don't have the same feelings as you do, and it's important to be able to empathize with your audience so that you are able to figure out what they want. And this is a really difficult task, but one of the ways that we do this, find out how the audience thinks, feels, reacts, etc., what motivates them, what causes frustration, what's important to them, is by talking to people. And usually this is done in a kind of field study or conducting interviews. Whatever method you choose, you need to be sure that your data is unbiased. This means that your questions have to remain neutral. You don't want to suggest to the user what their main frustrations are, and you need to be really wary of self-reported data. So how do you interview people to get these kinds of responses? A few tips include don't ask yes or no questions, don't ask leading questions, don't use language that can be misconstrued, don't ask the user to predict the future, don't ask them what they want, and don't make assumptions. And I'll dive into each of these a little more next. Daviz, did you want to jump in? All right, I'll go on. So don't ask yes or no questions. You want to keep the questions open-ended. Asking questions that result in yes or no limits the level of detail and context that you can get from your user. For example, if you're trying to figure out if your user currently does bank transfers, you might ask the user, have you ever sent a bank transfer? They'll respond yes or no, but that gives you no context around what transfers they do, how often they do it, and really if they do it currently. So instead you want to try something like, what kind of bank transfers do you make? And this prevents the user from answering just yes or no and gives you the context around their response. So even if they don't give the answer that you were looking for, you can ask some follow-up questions to kind of guide them without any bias. The next point is don't ask any leading questions. A common example of a leading question is asking something and then suggesting an answer or two. So for example, why do you visit a bank? To talk to your teller? This one is not only a yes or no question, but when you give a suggestion in the question, the user usually thinks more about that suggestion than what they actually do. People are also pretty reluctant to disagree with the interviewer. So if you suggest something, they're more likely going to say yes, even if it's not true, than go against what you're suggesting and give an honest response. So instead of saying something like, why do you visit your bank? To talk to a teller, try something that is more open-ended and doesn't have any suggestions. So just, why do you visit your bank? Don't ask the user to predict the future. No one can do that. And even if they say they're likely going to use a button or a feature, if you added it in, they don't actually know till they try it. Don't ask users what they want. Users do not know what they want. Questions should be phrased as, what are you trying to do, rather than what would you like us to do. You focus on the frustrations that users have rather than what they think the solution should be. So again, it's really figuring out the problem than trying to provide a solution without any context, really. If you're wondering why there's a horse and a car, it's because my favorite example of this is from Henry Ford, who made the Model T car, and innovated factory production to create an assembly line. So he said, if I had asked people what they want, they would have said faster horses, and then we wouldn't have cars. So asking people what they want is usually just a terrible idea. Don't make any assumptions. By assuming even the most basic details, you are likely missing out on valuable information, and you might even make the user feel bad about it. So this usually happens when you ask a question that you think you already know the answer to. For example, what was the last book you read? Instead of asking something like this, try, what do you like to do in your spare time? The latter is open-ended, while the former assumes that the user read a book recently, and if that's not true, they might feel stupid that they didn't. So you want to be really careful about assuming things about your audience and make sure that whatever you ask, if they have to say no to it, it doesn't make them feel bad. So once you get to know your audience as well as you can enter the define phase of the double diamond. Here you take your findings and analyze them into resources to help figure out the problem you're solving for. To help synthesize your findings, you can use tools like empathy maps, user personas, how might we statements, but today I'll go into a little bit of detail about user personas and how might we statements. So this is an example of a user persona. It's a fictitious character that represents a real person. And the important part of the user persona, well, there are many important parts, but the main one is that it's created on research. So you're not filling a user persona out just by saying, oh, I think my audience might think this way or that way. This is basically a synthesis of all the interviews that people have done, and through the responses, they're able to put together a template for what a member of their audience might think. Now, this having user persona is really important because it not only helps the team that you're working with build empathy with the person you're working for, you're designing for, you're creating this product to use, but it also kind of helps limit the scope of the project by reminding you that you're not creating a product for everyone to use. You're only creating a product for this specific type of person to use, or a few types of people to use. And another important part of this is that when you have a user persona, it helps you create a story for why you're creating the product, what it will be used for, who it's helping, and having a story that really connects with people is really going to help your pitch. So personas usually include background information, like here we have a person's age, their gender, behaviors, occupation. It should also include information like their needs, concerns, goals, motivations. And when you're designing your product or service, it helps a lot to use your user persona to put yourself in their shoes. Think how this character would act. Depending on your audience, you might have a few, but you're really trying to connect as much as you can with this fictitious person to better help understand how they think and act. Now, at the end of the discovery phase, the team should agree on a list of insights. What did you learn about your audience? How might we questions help prepare the problems that you found to be ideated on? So you have a lot of problems kind of swirling around your head, but how might we questions helps frame those problems so that you have more solutions to think of and more ideas to work on. So, for example, if your research finds that your users are unsure about what type of loan they need when opening a business, your how might we statement might be how might we make users feel more confident that they are applying for the correct loan. Now, kind of like the user interview questions, these statements do have a process for and a list of tips for how to make them. So your how might we statements should start with a problem that you've uncovered. You don't want to create a problem that you didn't actually hear. And this makes sure that you stay really on task and on goal for what you're trying to actually build. You want to avoid suggesting a solution in your question. So, like the discovery phase interviews, including an answer in your question will create bias. And for your team, it might cause your ideas to circulate more around the suggested solution, which would limit how many ideas that you come up with. Stay broad without losing the problem that you're trying to solve. It's really easy to just keep coming up with these problems and making them really vague so that you can have more ideas and more statements resulting, but you want to be sure that you're still staying on task. Focus on desired outcomes. We want to address why a user behaves the way they do rather than using a band-aid to address a symptom of the root behavior. So you want to make sure that you're solving for the actual problem, not the actions that resulted from the problem. Phrase your statements in a positive way because positive questions encourage creativity. So replace negative verbs such as reduce with positive action verbs like increase. The more how might we statements that you have, the more ideas you'll be able to get for possible solutions. Now, once you've whittled down all of your research into your problem statements, the next double diamond begins. And the first half of that is designing a solution for your problem. So it's coming up with as many ideas as you can that you'll be able to use to find what is best. Now, you want to get your creative juices flowing for this phase absolutely any way you can. Brainstorming, sketching, storyboarding, brain dumping, and writing down the worst possible ideas to kind of flip it on its head are all really common ways, but there's an infinite number of ways that people use to get their brain juices flowing. And I've heard people just walking into different rooms, maybe having like a different smell to just kind of mix and remix as much as possible. And your goal here is to create as many ideas as you can, no matter how bad they are. And you can do that also by remixing and building on each other's ideas. Once you have all the ideas spilled out, you need to select the ones that you think have the most potential and start mapping your product. This marks the start of the last phase called validate, and every time we see a double diamond expand, it's trying to get as much as possible there, and then when it decreases, it's narrowing everything down to one solution, one problem. I personally suggest making a list of features and functions that your team agrees need to be in your product. And I also like to rank them in order of importance, whether the feature is a need or a want. Does it absolutely need this feature to work? Or would it just be nice to have? Having a list like this helps make decisions in the future when features need to be cut out or added in. And once this list is made and complete, it shouldn't be changed going forward. So you need to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and no matter what, you do not add anything in later. This also really helps kind of narrow the scope to make sure that you don't get carried away with the project and add more and more until you find that you've bitten off more than you can chew. As you work through the product, something that can help you save time is creating user and task flows. And these ensure that the product is thoroughly mapped and thought through, and they'll help prevent from creating paths with dead ends. So a task flow is focuses on how a user can perform a specific task. It shows just one path. There are no decisions to be made. It's very straightforward, and it can be thought of from the user's perspective. So for example, here we have the task flow for finding a pancake recipe. The user starts on the home page, but it's not an official start. It's just a page that they happen to be on. They search pancake, they have the search results, and then they end up with the recipe. It's very broad, unlike user flows. So user flows are very similar, but they show all the possible paths that a user can take to achieve a goal or complete a task. So I like to start with a task flow just to get it on paper and then build that into a user flow to make sure that I understand every action the user can take, every decision that they have to make. And as you can see, something as simple as finding a pancake recipe can turn into this very large map for every decision that the user has to go through to end up with that recipe. Once you feel confident about the functionality that your product will have and what avenues the user can take to achieve their goals, it's time to start building your wireframes. It's worth noting that there are various tests you can do to make sure your content is on track, and if you're interested in any of those, you just put it in the chat. But if we skip from user flows to wireframes, this is a pretty good place to start. So what are wireframes? They're essentially a visual guide to how a user will interact with your product. There are two types of wireframes, and they're kind of on a scale. So you can have lo-fi or hi-fi, but where it lands is a little bit subjective. Lo-fi wireframes are generally just very simple and very quick, and you can start just sketching on paper or using even sticky notes to pretend that this is a button and this is an image or something like that. And the more you work on the wireframe and as you complete it, it becomes hi-fi. Hi-fi is basically the same thing, but it's styled. It doesn't have placeholder logos or pictures. It doesn't have placeholder buttons, and it's as close as you can get to the final product without it actually being the product. When you start your designs, you want to keep them as lo-fi and tactile as possible. And kind of like mentioned earlier, it's much easier to fix mistakes when things are lo-fi than having to redo the styling and the text when they're hi-fi. So when your wireframe is still very low fidelity, lo-fi, you should put it in front of as many people as you can, making sure that they're your target group. So you want to ask them for feedback. You ask yourself questions like, does the solution meet the user's needs? Is this the path I expected the user to take? Did the user have any points of confusion? And as you watch someone interact and say, oh, like looking here to find whatever this is, I would click on this button. If they click on the wrong button, you know that you have to fix something. So your product will remain in an iterative cycle for a very long time, and pretty much till the end. Your goal is to iron out any flaws that your product has before you spend that time and effort making it look really nice. So you know when you need to make a wireframe and do design, but how do you come up with one? How do you make something that's usable? There's a lot that goes into it, so I'll cover some of the basic tips. Stick to what is tried and true. Each of you are trying to create an innovative product, but that doesn't mean that your execution has to be completely different than from what's already out there. When it comes to creating something that's usable, your best bet is to use practices that are already out there. So if you notice that a certain type of, let's say, e-commerce site has buttons over here and has filters like this, you want to use those practices. People are used to using them, so they'll know what to expect, which is really important. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Simplify the process as much as you can. Don't add extra steps or barriers that aren't needed. Nobody wants to sign up for an account while they're in the process of checking out while shopping online. So the more simple and clear-cut you keep it, the happier your user is going to be. And this also helps you out by limiting your scope. So don't add any extra fluff. Make sure that your content is legible. Some fonts are super fun to use, but in general, they make things more difficult for people to read. And because of that, you want to stay away from the complicated fonts and bright colors that can hinder legibility. Your content should be scannable. So if someone can't look at what you have and quickly tell what it says, then there's something wrong, and it's not legible enough. You need to make it a lot more clear. And one of the tests that's actually used is called a 5-second test. You put your homepage or your marketing page in front of a person, and you let them look at it for 5 seconds after never having seen it before. When the 5 seconds is done, you ask them to say the top words that came to mind, the top phrases, and what they think your product does. Because 5 seconds is a really long time when somebody is trying to figure out what you stand for exactly. So if someone can't tell in 5 seconds what they're looking at, then you need to consider redesigning your product so that it's a lot more clear. Be consistent. Your layouts, buttons, your language should be consistent throughout your product. Switching up any of these components will confuse your users if they're expecting the main buttons to be a certain look, a certain color. Changing it completely is going to make that button a lot harder for people to find. And then these last three I'll go into a little bit more detail. So creating visual hierarchy, optimize for mobile devices, and follow the WCAG standards. There are many ways to create visual hierarchy. Sites need a visual hierarchy to prevent them from feeling overwhelming to look at. Like a lot of those early 2000 sites, it just feels horrible to look at. If a site has too much text, too many images, it's crowded, the user won't know what to focus on. So take advantage of something like reading patterns, which is this picture on the left. In Western countries, you'll see a lot of sites structured in Z or F patterns. Everybody reads from top to bottom, but depending on the culture and location, it varies on whether it's left to right. But in Western countries, it's top to bottom, left to right, and our eyes tend to just drift in a Z or an F pattern. So all of your content should be structured so that when a user looks across the screen in one of these ways, they're not missing any of the important details. In general, the larger an object on the screen, the more important a person may perceive it to be. So you don't want to make your main action button smaller than your log out button or something that they don't necessarily need right then and there. You want to make sure that your important buttons are pretty large and easy to find. Your important text is larger and easy to find. Make sure that you take advantage of the size, the color, the white space, and how your components are aligned to make the right parts of your interface stand out. With color, you can use contrast to attract the user's attention to something, and with white space, the closer objects are together, people perceive them as groups. So you don't want two unrelated things really close. Instead, you want to have some space in between them so that a person can look at one part, kind of take a little mental break, know there's a division, and then look at the second part. And in this image here, we can see that the one labeled poor visual hierarchy on the left, it has a lot of the elements that are the same size. So out of the two boxes, you don't necessarily know which one is more important, which one you should be focused on. But on the right side, they reorganized it so that they're saying that the blue box is more important and the orange button is the most important. So your eyes are drawn first to the box and then to the content on the side of it, which is probably related to the left and maybe an important explanation or a caption, kind of depending on what it is. You need to optimize your screens for mobile devices. 92% of all internet users have access to the internet with their mobile device. In the banking world, mobile banking is becoming more and more prominent. Users want to gain an easy way to access their finances using their phones, and that trend and those numbers are only growing. So mobile devices are extremely important, and they need to be treated differently from computer screens. They're a completely different size, and it's a lot harder to look at a website that's only for desktop on your mobile screen. So when you're designing for phones, you want to keep your menus simple and large. You shouldn't make your users need to zoom in or scroll to find any important options that they have. If you take your phone and you hold it in your hand, you can notice how much of the screen is easy to reach, difficult to reach, and unreachable, kind of like the graphic here, without changing the position of your hand. The more the user needs to reach a certain button, the easier it should be to reach. So in the parts that are labeled hard, you shouldn't have your main button like sign up or register. It should be in the natural location, and you do need to keep in mind whether you know if most of your users are right-handed or left-handed. If you're making some kind of app specifically for left-handed users, that's definitely something that you would need to keep in mind and design around. So build responsive pages. When you assign a width to a page, keep it in percentages so that it's easier to change. Now, WCAG standards stand for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. Roughly 1.2 billion people across the globe have some form of disability. Even if you don't have any disabilities now, you never know when something could happen and you find yourself as part of that statistic. So in general, it's important to design for accessibility, and designing that way actually makes a product easier to consume for everyone and easier to use. So it's always a good idea to keep these standards in mind. The principles include perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And that just means that the language here is very specific, because perceivable means that you need to present things in a ways that user can perceive, not necessarily see, not necessarily just listen to. So I will go over some of the different disabilities that can cause someone to use your product, that would affect the experience of using your product. So the first one I have is auditory. If your product uses sound-related media, make sure that you can accommodate those that cannot hear well or at all, and consider making captions for all video content. And this is true especially if someone's looking at your product on their phone. Maybe they're in a crowded space and they can't hear what video you have playing, so it's important to always have an alternative. Cognitive disabilities can make it difficult for a person to remember things, focus on a task for an extended period of time. To accommodate cognitive disabilities, you should simplify the content as much as possible. Physical disabilities limit a person's range of motion. Make sure that the buttons and other important elements are easy to reach. I don't know an app that does this, but you would want to make sure that a person doesn't need to walk around to access it or something like that. If your product requires voice commands, it would be extremely difficult for someone with a speech disability to use. So consider an alternate route to accommodate those who cannot speak clearly. So don't make your app only in voice commands. And color blindness is one of the most prominent visual disabilities. It's important to understand that this means they process colors differently. So people who are colorblind, they don't just see in black and white, but some of the colors that might look like it has high contrast to you or me might actually have no contrast to someone who is colorblind. So you can actually make sure that you can design around this using a color contrast checker. And the one I have here is called WebAIM. Essentially, you plug in the hex codes for your foreground and your background, and if it's above a certain level, it'll let you know that this is a good combination to use. But if it's below a certain level, um, it would be in red on the website, and it says that the contrast is too low. So ideally, you want to make sure that everything is pretty high contrast and all the information that's important, definitely can be seen by anyone on any kind of device. And it's worth noting that banking and money is just something that every single person needs to use and uses, and especially in blockchain with Bitcoin, it's a huge learning curve for a lot of people. So it's really, really important to make it as accessible as possible. Now, once you're confident that your designs are ready for polishing, you will build your prototype. And a prototype in the design world, it can be as simple as you want, but if you're not using just paper and pencil, or you don't want to, especially if you're virtual, it might be easier to use an online tool. So I have a list of different ones here. My favorite one is Figma, and it's just what I use because it has a whiteboarding tool where you can get your team to work on something with you, but it's also free, which is very nice. And it can do extremely low fidelity wireframes or high fidelity, and you can do a lot of design prototypes as well. But the others are all great tools, and it just kind of depends what you're comfortable with. Now, once you're done with your design prototype, make sure that you test it. Make sure that you iron out all of the different flaws that people have, that you find your flows have. It should be a very simple and smooth experience for someone to use. And like mentioned before, you just want to iterate testing as often as you can to make sure that everything is fixed by the time you're done. For a general rule of thumb, it takes 5 to 10 people to figure out most of the usability issues that your product has. So you want to keep that number in mind when you ask somebody to complete a task. In conclusion, this here is the design thinking circle. It's very similar to the double diamond, but in my opinion, it's just a little bit less detailed. But you want to talk to people, you want to empathize with them, make sure that you really understand where they're coming from, what their motivations and frustrations are, and how you can help them. Define your problem, make sure that it addresses the right audience. Brainstorm as many ideas as you can during this phase. No idea is bad. You want to put it all on paper, think all of them through. It might surprise you what you end up coming up with. Create a prototype, test, and iterate until you're ready to implement. And I've included a few resources as well, and maybe we can put the links on Discord, but if you're looking for resources to help you out, the Nielsen-Norman group is always a really good UX resource. They have a lot of articles for how to do specific steps. The Interaction Design Foundation as well is very similar, and also a UX-focused site that has a lot of articles for how to do certain things. For visual aspects, Laws of UX is a really interesting site where it has a lot of the psychology-backed laws for how to arrange items. For example, I mentioned earlier, items together, people automatically know that they're grouped together. A lot of UX goes over that and a lot of the other different rules. Quick Sprout has been a very useful guide for the basics on a lot of the visual aspects. And WCAG is the accessibility standards. They have their own site for how to for their guidelines and kind of every aspect. I do admit it's a little bit difficult to look through, but it's definitely a source of truth for design. And then WebAIM is the color contrast checker, but there are many out there. And last but not least, I added the Bitcoin design guide. It's a community built guide, but it has a lot of the aspects needed when designing for Bitcoin. So it has how to use their logos, how to use typography and color codes to make an app or a product look like it belongs with Bitcoin. So it really helps figure out the tone and the brand of Bitcoin and how to integrate it with something else. And that is all that I have. So if anyone has any questions, I think now is the time. Yeah, the links will definitely be shared.
I have a question. Is there a difference when we're designing, for example, app which as a team has a banking and then another app which as a team has a Bitcoin? So you mentioned the Bitcoin kind of guidelines, but what will be your take on kind of differences between a classical bank product and Bitcoin product, let's say?
Yeah, so that is a really good question, and part of the reason why this Bankathon is so interesting. In my experience, banks are extremely highly regulated, and they're an interesting balance of wanting to help people, but also making lots of money for themselves. And it's definitely not transparent at all. So a lot of the traditional banks are very uncomfortable with something being really transparent, and they have tons of fees and all that stuff. But the blockchain community and Bitcoin specifically, it's kind of the opposite. It's extremely transparent, extremely accessible. So when you're combining the two worlds, it's difficult because you have kind of the opposite ends trying to find a balance. So you want to make sure that you keep the bank's needs in mind while also having the integrity of Bitcoin. Another interesting part is just at the most basic level, people are used to having their usernames and passwords uh, being entered into their bank applications, but with Bitcoin, you have your wallets, addresses, stuff like that. Um, and you need to keep in mind that everybody is trying to use this. So you need to make it as familiar as possible, as basic as possible, and try to find that middle ground where both worlds can understand what you're trying to do.
Thanks, Tamara, and thanks, Elena, for your question. Does anybody else have another question for Tamara for the UX design for her presentation that she just shared with you all? Remember, for the links, we're going to share them right in a moment, right here. In case we can't do it on time, we're going to do it over Discord. By the way, I encourage you, Tamara, to share your Discord user right now for those who are interested maybe in talk to you privately and maybe discuss some project issues for their hackathon project. So I guess it should be good if you can share with them how to find you over Discord in case they have more questions about it. Okay. Si alguien más tiene alguna pregunta también del público hispano, por favor escriban ahí en el chat. Tamara va a escribir también su usuario de Discord para aquellas personas que tengan preguntas un poco más enfocadas a sus proyectos, se las puedan hacer llegar a través de Discord. Okay, so there's no more questions. Don't feel stopped, guys. Please continue.
Hi, I've got a quick question. Are there any standards around graduated accessibility? Because the thing is that you can't cater for every single community when you go live. It just becomes ridiculously expensive because some communities may not even be interested in using your app. And so it's kind of like, what's your take on that? And are there any standards which we could look up in terms of sort of like an accessibility roadmap? Like, you know, we'll cater for these people in the beginning, and then, you know, as uptake sort of like comes through, we'll then include more and more communities, but in a balanced way. Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, you're saying that accessibility can become expensive. So how do you balance the cost with making it usable? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah. In a nutshell, that is it. But it's more like the question is whether there are any standards around graduated. So sort of like a roadmap pattern of how to typically address accessibility when trying to deal with the general public, and providing a public service / government / service. Because like banks are basically like, you know, the other government that nobody wants to talk about, right? So the thing is that they have to do the exact same things that, you know, you would do if you're offering, you know, let's say a trash service, or if you're offering like a health service. You still have to have that accessibility, but you're not going to support all of it on day one. You're going to support different bits of it as you go along. So I was just curious to find out whether there are any sort of like open standards around that, and any things which, you know, you would recommend looking up. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that for banks, a lot of the accessibility work that they have is behind the scenes, and you probably wouldn't know about it unless you have some kind of disability that really needs it. But on the very basic level, banks make sure that they have the right font sizes, the right colors. They don't have anything that relies only on audio. And those are some of the basics that I listed before that don't really take a lot of effort to implement, because if you think about it, it's kind of like just designing for someone who might be a little bit older. You want to make sure that they can easily read and understand. But banks are really cautious with it, and they usually offer a lot of accessibility services on the side, because if somebody is using their product and they make a mistake because they couldn't read the fine print or something like that, then a lot of the time banks can be held responsible and get sued. So banks take it very, very, very seriously. And I think, in my opinion, I think a lot of the time the ugly interfaces that they often have is because they put accessibility first and foremost and don't really want to change things quickly to make sure that it stays really accessible. As far as a roadmap, I don't know if there's an official one, but I definitely would start with the color contrast, the text legibility. You don't want to use words that are like a very high reading level, because you don't know, it's unlikely that most people would understand that. So there are definitely a lot of disabilities that are quite niche that you would be aware of, but I don't know if there's a roadmap to address them. There are ways to account for accessibility while coding, for example, using screen readers and having the keyboard able to jump to the right elements with the right buttons, but I don't know if there's a roadmap to address it, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right, Tamara, we have another question in the chat. I'm just trying to convert it. So he has an issue about the development of the project for the Amerita Bank. A direct contact with the objective public. It's that the people from El Salvador and the social media put them over to promote each platform like from now. And the idea from the Bankathon is the connection that they can pick after or right now to affinate this idea or concept before the development. Okay. So I guess his question is more about the elements from the development that are prioritized for the bank and they need to take on account to work with over the project. So I don't know if you have any advice about this.
Yeah, so I think that in a hackathon setting, it highly depends on what your final product, what you want it to look like. But if you want it to be really developed with multiple screens, I would say that responsiveness is a top priority to make sure that it can be used both on a computer and on your mobile device. And then the UI designers might hate me for this, but I would say that style is the least important. You want to prioritize a smooth functionality over everything else. So if a person can quickly navigate your screens, they find it intuitive to use. And by intuitive, I don't necessarily mean that they look at it and they know exactly what to do. I mean that they use it once and they remember how to use it forever. I would definitely prioritize the button location and labeling of those buttons over style aspects.
Thank you, Tamara. Lesser 7, básicamente Tamara nos está compartiendo que lo importante cuando estás haciendo tu aplicación es que te fijes muy bien en dónde vas a estar colocando los botones, los tamaños, las fuentes, que quizá lo estilista, lo estético no es tan importante, pero tienes que pensar mucho en cómo las personas se van a quedar con esa idea una vez que la estén viendo. Si para ti tu prioridad es que ellos estén revisando tu programa, y te gustaría que realmente les impactara en el momento en que están leyendo lo que tú estás poniendo, tienes que tener en cuenta eso, qué los va a hacer atractivamente visual y los va a dejar ahí. También es muy importante que tengas en cuenta el uso del teléfono, ya que ahorita es una herramienta muy esencial. Siempre trata de hacer que haga un match lo que estés realizando en tu computadora, pero que también en tu teléfono se esté viendo de buena forma. ¿Vale? No sé si te sientas conforme con la respuesta, que espero haber tocado todos los detalles que igual Tamara estuvo compartiendo, pero si por favor hay algo más que nos quieras comentar, por favor hazlo.
Yes, and if I can add something on that. So one of the aspects of the judging criteria is working apps. So as Tamara mentioned, yes, the design is important. So we don't to follow some of the principles, but yeah, the working apps are encouraged. So if you spend too much time on the design and making sure it looks very, very pretty, but then at the end the bottoms, like the button does not work, then probably you will not get the maximum points for the completion as a judge criteria. So that's yeah, just to add that.
Thank you, Lena. Lo que Elena nos compartió en este momento es que prácticamente la funcionalidad tiene que estar al 100, por muy bonito que se vea, si tú al clicar un botón no está funcionando la reacción que tú esperas o el viaje por el usuario, la verdad es que eso no te va a dar puntos en absoluto. Entonces, ten en cuenta que por muy estético que lo puedas poner, es muy importante el cómo haces que todo funcione en conjunto, ¿vale? Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Tamara, for your time and for an amazing explanation of this UX design journey you just made us go through. So we just want to make this checkout pretty quickly. Tell us, according to the Kevin scale, how do you feel about your Bankathon idea? Please share us. You just need to tell us the number from 1 to 6. All right. Para todas aquellas personas, vamos a hacer este pequeño checkout. Por favor, díganos cómo se sienten de acuerdo a la escala de Gavin, del 1 al 6, respecto a su idea del Bankathon. All right. So we are reading you. Please share with us. How do you feel about this idea you already have? You just need to share the number. You just need to share with us how do you feel. You don't need to tell us things specifically, ¿ok? Por favor, compártanos cómo se sienten del 1 al 7, no nos tienen que compartir detalles, simplemente nos tienen que ayudar a comprender si se sienten muy bien, a gustos, mal, hartos, etcétera, ¿no? Vale, please. Can someone share with us how do you feel with your Bankathon idea? We are reading you right now. Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan says number 4. So basically, he's he's not feeling good about it, but you can make it. We still have time for this. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Tamara. So we just want to encourage you to keep sharing the Bitcoin Bankathon hashtag for the social media hero. All right. And for further notice, we also want you to know that, thank you, for the next steps, okay? If you still need support, please, over Discord, there's always going to be someone helping you go through this, okay? Also, you need to finish the registration for your theme, okay, on that post. Also, if you need help with this, go through Discord, okay? RSVP to the physical event on Eventbrite. So the Eventbrite event, it's already available right now. I think one of the OBP team is going to share with you the link for the Eventbrite. However, it's really important for us to know who is coming with us, who is not, and that will help us manage the balance on how to do this pitch and storytelling ideas for you online and on site. Okay. Also practice your pitch. You already have an idea that will help us polish it and make it stronger for you. Okay. And finally, please be active on social media. Okay. I'm gonna say this in Spanish. Por favor, para todas aquellas personas que tienen complicaciones de cualquier tipo, pueden hacerlo a través de Discord. Ya conocen las cuentas, ya conocen los canales, así que cualquier duda que tengan, por favor, aún estamos a tiempo. Ya la siguiente semana vamos a empezar con el pitch y es muy importante que ya podamos ir trabajando en todo esto. ¿Ok? Si aún les hace falta registrar a su equipo, háganlo en DevPost. Si tienen alguna duda de cómo hacerlo, Discord también es el canal para que los apoyen a través de esto. El evento en Eventbrite ya se está compartiendo. Esto es para saber qué personas van a estar acompañándonos presencialmente en el evento, quienes no lo van a hacer. Así que es muy importante tenerlo en cuenta porque así vamos a manejar el equipo, quienes van a estar en línea apoyándolos y quienes no estarían en línea y estarían directamente en el sitio. ¿Vale? Practiquen un pitch. En caso de que ya tengan algo, lo podemos pulir, lo podemos reforzar, que es parte de la idea. Y finalmente sean activos en las redes sociales. ¿Vale? So that will be it. Thank you so much, everyone. Muchísimas gracias a todos por asistir. Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Elena. Gracias, Tamara. Gracias, Elena. Gracias a todos por estar aquí. Así que, por favor, muchísimas gracias. Así que, ¿cuál es el link de Eventbrite? I don't know if someone from the team has the Eventbrite link, but if not, don't worry, we will share with you this over Discord. Si no tienes ahorita, Jonathan, el link, se te va a hacer llegar en Discord, ¿ok? Así que no te preocupes por ahora, no es algo que nos surja ya, ¿vale? Thank you so much, everyone. See you later. Bye-bye.